19th, we're going to have Ryan Wrigley. Some of you might remember him from October's meeting. This one is going to be about keeping wildlife wild, and that's because in the spring we're going to have lots of babies. We're going to have baby squirrels, baby bunnies, just babies coming out of our ears. So this is going to be about what do you do when you find one. So it's about keeping wildlife wild, and that's going to be, it's going to be a good time. So hopefully we'll see you April 19th. Now tonight we have the amazing Bob here to talk to us. The amazing Bob.
Not that amazing.
He's going to talk to us about the science of Fibonacci Brewing, practical example of the Fibonacci Sequence in brewing.
No, thank you.
Right.
Awesome. Well, first I want to thank CJ for having me present today. This is something I haven't done in a long time, and I've never presented on what I'm about to, so bear with me if I stumble and what have you. All right. Who is familiar with Fibonacci sequence? Is everyone here, at least, yeah, probably most of you, I would imagine. Not a whole lot. Okay. What about brewing? Is everyone here? You know how to drink the beer. You familiar? Yeah. Well, I'll be. Yeah, if you want to be a Trappist brewery, yes. Well, we'll be going over both tonight. So I'll do some background on the Fibonacci sequence. I'll also discuss a little bit about the brewing process, and then we'll talk about a collaboration that we did with two other breweries, which was an homage to the Fibonacci sequence, where we tried to incorporate as many different aspects of the Fibonacci sequence into the beer. All right, so first off is why Fibonacci Brewing? Why did we choose this name for our brewery? Betty's background, my wife here, she is big into nature, especially plants, horticulture, permaculture, and just the way plants grow in general. My background's math and science. I'm a software engineer by trade, and so it was a way that we could tie my love of math and science with Betty's love of nature, because the Fibonacci sequence actually models the way that a lot of plants grow in nature. And of course, the hop plant is a perfect example. We have some hanging above the bar here. But hop cones, which is a primary ingredient in brewing, actually models the way Fibonacci sequence goes in nature. All right, so what exactly is the Fibonacci sequence? It's a very simple sequence. So it's found by adding the two preceding numbers together to get the next one. So you can go 1 and 1 is 2, 1 and 2 is 3, 2 and 3 is 5, 3 and 5 is 8, so on and so forth. The Fibonacci sequence itself is actually observed in all kinds of aspects in nature. So the most common examples that you're probably aware of, the nautilus shell is a very good example, the way that it spirals out in nature, as well as many of the ways that the petals and the leaves separate themselves when plants grow. All right. The Fibonacci sequence also actually shows itself in many other applications too. So it's not just math and science and nature. They actually use it a lot in financial data for modeling the way stocks are going up and down. They can get the strength of the stock according to Fibonacci sequence. It also presents itself in music and art, and we're actually going to see the collaboration we did is actually inspired by music. So I don't know if many of you are familiar with the band Tool, but they wrote a song called Lateralis, and that song is all about the Fibonacci sequence, and that's kind of what inspired us to do this beer. The other thing with the Fibonacci sequence is it actually has a direct correlation with what's known as the golden ratio. So when you hear these two terms, they're pretty much interchangeable. The Fibonacci sequence, as we already discussed, is adding the next two digits to get the previous two digits to get the following digit. And as we see, if we take those digits and we turn them into ratios with the current number over the previous number, we'll see that that number, as you go larger and larger, keeps getting closer and closer to 1.618, which is the golden ratio. So if we were to keep going there, you would see it even diverging even more and more on being exactly 1.618 there. Oh. All right, so this is a video of the explanation of the Fibonacci sequence. I'm not sure I did it enough justice. This lady's name is Vi Hart. She speaks very fast, but she's also very entertaining. So try to keep up with her here.
Oh, and because of other cutting in the school, anyway, you've decided there's 3 basic kinds of spirals. There's a kind where you spiral out, you keep the same distance, or you could start big but make it tighter and tighter as you go along the piece of spiral ends. Or you could start tight but make the spiral bigger as you go out. The first kind is good if you really want to fill up with lines, or if you want to draw curled up snakes. You can start with a wonky shape to spiral around, but notice that as you spiral out, you get rounder and rounder. Probably something to do with how the ratio between two different numbers of closest one is repeated when you have the same number to both. But you can bring the wonk back by exaggerating the bumps, and it gets all optical illusion. Anyway, you're not sure what the second kind of spiral is for, but I guess it's a good way to draw snuggled up slope. Machines even invented this kind of spiral from feeling useless. This third spiral, however, is good for all sorts of things. You could draw snail or an shell, an elephant with a curled trunk, the horns of a sheep, a fluid frog, a cochlea, and an inner ear diagram, and ear itself. Those other spirals can help with these also a clearly superior kind of spiral, but I draw more subplots. Here's one way to draw a really perfect spiral. Start with one square and draw another next to it that is the same height. Make the next square fit next to both together, that is, each side is length 2. The next square has length 3. The entire outside shape will always be a rectangle. Keep spiraling around, adding bigger and bigger squares. This one has side length 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, and now 21. Once you do that, you can add a curve going through each square, arcing from one corner to the opposite corner. Resist the urge to zip quickly across the diagonal if you want a nice smooth spiral. Have you ever looked at the spirally pattern on a pine cone and thought, hey, sure, a spiral's on this pine cone? I don't know why there's pine cones in the greenhouse. Maybe this is in a forest. Anyway, there's spirals. 8 going this way. Or you could look at the spirals going the other way and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Look familiar? 8 and 13 are both numbers in the Fibonacci series. That's the one where you start by adding 1 and 1 to get 2, then 1 and 2 to get 3, 2 and 3 to get 5, 3 plus 5 is 8, 5 plus 8 is 13, and so on. Some people think that instead of starting with 1 plus 1, you should start with 0 and 1. 0 plus 1 is 1, 1 plus 1 is 2, 1 plus 2 is 3, and it continues on the same way as starting with 1 and 1. Or I guess you could start with 1 plus 0, and that would work too. Or why not go back one more to -1, and so on. Anyway, if you're into the Fibonacci series, you probably have a bunch memorized. I mean, gotta know 1, 1, 2, 3, 5. Finish off the single digits with 8, and ooh, that's so spooky. And once you're memorizing double digits, you might as well know 21, 34, 55, 89, so that whenever someone turns a Fibonacci number, you can say, happy Fib birthday. And then, isn't it interesting that 144, 233, 377, 610 breaks that pattern, so you better know that one too. And oh my goodness, 987 is a neat number, and we'll see how these things get out of hand. Anyway, 'tis the season for decorative scented pine cones, and if you're putting glitter glue spirals on your pine cones during math class, you might notice that the number of spirals are 5 and 8, or 3 and 5, or 3 and 5 again, 5 and 8. This one was 8 and 13, and one Fibonacci pine cone is one thing, but all of them? What is up with that? This pine cone has this funky weird part, maybe that messes it up. Let's on the top, 5 and 8, and let's check the bottom. If you wanted to draw a mathematically realistic pine cone, you might start by drawing 5 spirals one way and 8 going the other. I'm going to mark out starting and ending points for my spirals first as a guide, and then draw the arms, 8 one way and 5 the other. Now I can fill in the little pine cone form. So there's Fibonacci numbers in pine cones, but are there Fibonacci numbers in other things that start with pine? Let's count the spirals on this thing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. The leaves are hard to keep track of, but they're in spirals too. Fibonacci numbers. What if we looked at these really tight spirals going almost straight up? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. That's a Fibonacci number. Can we find a third spiral on this pine cone? Sure, go down like this, and 2021. But that's only a couple examples. How about this thing I found on the side of the road? I don't know what it is. It probably starts with pine though. 5 and 8. Let's see how far the conspiracy goes. What else has spirals in it? This artichoke is 5 and 8. So does this artichoke-looking flower thing, and this cactus fruit does too. There's an orange cauliflower with 5 and 8, and a green one with 5 and 8. I mean, 5 and 8. Oh, it's actually 5 and 8. Maybe plants just like these numbers though. Doesn't mean it has anything to do with Fibonacci, does it? So let's go for some higher numbers. We're going to use some flowers. Just got 13 and 21. It's easy to write it down. They have 21 and 34. Now let's bring in the big guns. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 17, 18, 34, 42, 53, 54, 55. I promise this is a random flower and I didn't make it out especially to trick you into thinking there's Fibonacci numbers and things, but you should really count for yourself next time you see something spirally. There's even Fibonacci numbers in how the leaves are arranged on this stalk, or this one, or the Brussels sprouts on this stalk are a beautiful, delicious 3 and 5. Fibonacci is even in the arrangement of the petals on this rose, and some flowers have shown Fibonacci numbers as high as 144. It seems pretty cosmic and wondrous, but the cool thing about the Fibonacci series and spiral is not that it's this big, complicated, mystical, magical supermath thing beyond the comprehension of our human mind. If you look mysteriously everywhere, you'll find that these numbers aren't weird at all. In fact, it would be weird if they weren't. Right there. Utterly intricate patterns can result in utterly simple beginnings.
I know, right? That's actually the first part of a 3-part series that she does on the Fibonacci sequence. It's really interesting series. She'll go into other sequences that other plants in nature model. So it's not always the Fibonacci sequence, which is pretty interesting. Yeah. So now we'll get into our collaboration beer that we did with Alexandria Brewing and Darkness Brewing in Kentucky. The owners of both breweries, good friends of ours, and we were sitting around one night and started talking about the Fibonacci sequence, of course. And, of course, Tool gets brought up because, we like music and we all appreciate Tool. So we started talking about what if we were to make a beer around the Fibonacci sequence and, for our homage to this song Lateralis by Tool. So that's where we came up with the concept. The breakdown of the lyrics here, and we'll watch a video here on it in a few seconds, but we'll see the first 2 verses here. So this one here and this here. It goes up from 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 5, 3. So it starts coming back down. Oh, not the second one here. And then it skips the second one on the first time through and goes 13, 8, 5, 3. So it kind of jumps around there, and it's not readily apparent initially that it is going up and down the Fibonacci sequence. But then on the second time they go through, then they add this missing verse here. And you can see then it completes the scale. So it's 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 5, 3, 2, 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, and then 13, 8, 5, 3. So that's the total sequence. So they kind of tease us the first time through by skipping that middle verse, but then the second time through they complete it. All right. And I'm going to kind of jump around here because this is a long song, so we're going to get closer to where they actually start singing the lyrics here. This is the second time through now, so they'll put that other verse in the middle here. And that's it. What's that?
Oh, it's doing lighting up the triangle when it folds into the square.
During the video?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. I did know the one part, I don't know if you noticed where it was going around and every 137.5 degrees it was kind of shooting off. That's actually the way petals form on flower stems. They're usually 137.5 away, and that's all based off the Fibonacci sequence. So yeah, that was our inspiration for this collaboration beer. So then we obviously had to incorporate as many of the features of the Fibonacci sequence as we could into the beer. So before we delve into exactly what we did as far as the recipe formulation and everything, I'm going to give you a little background on the brewing process itself. So for those that aren't familiar, brewing is typically thought of in three different realms. So you have your mash. During the mash process, that's the first step of the process, you are converting all the starches in the grains into sugars. So the way that happens is you typically heat the water up, usually between 150 and 160 degrees. You're going to hold it for about an hour, and during that process, you're going to convert starches into sugars. You need about 80% of a base grain. All base grain means is that it actually has enzymes in it that will help with the conversion process. So you need at least 80% to have enough enzymes to convert the starches into sugars. The next aspect of the brewing process is called the boil. I think this is what most people think of whenever they talk about brewing. This is where you bring it up to a boil. And the primary thing you're trying to do during that is what's called hop isomerization. So you're trying to extract as much of the alpha acids out of the hops as possible to give bitterness to the beer. So all beers, even beers that appear sweet to you, they have some level of hops to them to balance out the sweetness. If you don't add hops to a beer, then it would be way cloyingly sweet and it wouldn't be very enjoyable to drink more than one or two. The third part of the process is the fermentation. And this is where the yeast actually converts all of those sugars that you created during the mashing process into what we know as alcohol. So the joke is that brewers don't actually make any beer. We make what's called wort, and that's just sugar water. It's the yeast that actually converts that into what we know as beer. The other part of the fermentation process is, in addition to creating alcohol, it also gives off CO2. So during that process, you're typically just letting the CO2 escape so that, you know, your vessel that you're fermenting in doesn't blow up. All right, so that's the brewing process. So this is the actual beer that we came up with. All right, so like I said, we tried to come up with as many things that are related to Fibonacci throughout. So first up is we're going to do one recipe, right? So it's going to be a Cascadian Dark Ale, which is just kind of a fancy name for black IPA. It's actually kind of between a black IPA and like a robust porter, but more on the black IPA side. We decide we're going to use one strand of yeast for this. Some of the beers we do, so you're drinking the Belgian here. Our Belgian, we actually use 2 strands of yeast. Our sours, we use 2 strands of yeast. So it's very common to blend yeast together to get certain characteristics. But for this one, we're just using a single strain. That's California ale yeast. It's a very clean yeast. It doesn't really impart much character on the beer. We chose to use 2 different varieties of hops for this, so Cascade and Chinook. Cascade has to be present in order for it to be a Cascadian dark ale, but then typically it's got at least one other type of hop in a Cascadian dark ale. As I mentioned, this was a collaboration between 3 breweries. So us here at Fibonacci, Darkness Brewing down in, what is that, Bellevue? Dayton? What are they officially? Are they Bellevue? I think, yep, Bellevue. And Alexandria Brewing down in Alexandria, Kentucky. We chose 5 different malts for this beer. The U.S. Pale, that is in the Maris Otter, those are our 2 base malts that I was talking about earlier. So those comprise the majority of the grain bill for this beer. We also had a rye malt, a crystal malt, 60 Lovibond. That's just the color rating on it. So the higher the Lovibond character is, the more color it's going to add to it. And then a black patent malt. So this beer comes out looking like a stout and drinking somewhere between like a stout or porter and an IPA. So that black patent malt is the one that's giving it the black characteristic in this beer. Our target was 8% ABV. To get that much alcohol in a beer, you have to add a lot of sugars for that yeast to consume. So this was, for us, on the higher end. Anything above about 8% means that we have to do another mash and a boil on our system in order to fill up one of our fermenters. So this particular beer, we have to go through that mash and boil process 3 times before we can do the fermentation, because our brewing system is a little bit smaller than what our fermenters can handle. This beer had a total of 13 ingredients. That includes all the malts we use, the hops we use, the yeast we use, the water, and the brewing chemicals. So we use what's called brewing salts or chemicals to create the water profile that we want depending on the beer that we're creating. So we might use a completely different beer if we're going to have a more sweet, malt-forward beer than if we're going to create a more hoppy, bitter beer. So the water chemistry that you use to get either the hops to pop or the malt to be front and center is different water chemistry. Our batch size, like I said, the ABV got up high enough that it actually dropped down. Our batch sizes are 60 gallons about with finished product, but the actual batch size is about 63, 64 gallons total. So with those 3 mashes and the 3 boils, that means that the actual batch size that we were brewing was 21 gallons at a time. The SRM is the color of the beer. So that's a color scale that indicates how light or dark something is. So the SRM for this beer came out to 34, which is pretty dark. And then the final aspect is 55, which is the IBUs for this beer. So IBUs stands for International Bittering Units. It's just a way to measure the amount of alpha acids that were extracted during the boil process. So we made it all the way up to 55. I think that was pretty successful for us overall. We were hoping to get to triple digits, but once we got to 55, we just couldn't, you start changing different aspects of it and it throws the other numbers off. So yeah, we consider this a fairly successful endeavor for us as far as being able to incorporate all the way up to 55. Unfortunately, we do not have this beer on tap today. We've only ever brewed it once. This was like 3 or 4 years ago. Maybe even longer. Do you remember when we made that? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Good point. Good point. And then -1 is how everyone's feeling about that. But yeah, we've actually incorporated aspects of the Fibonacci sequence in other beers of ours. In fact, our signature IPA, Earth Daisy, which is also not on right now, that one is 89 IBUs, and we do a boil for 89 minutes. Those I specifically chose because that's the Fibonacci number. So yeah, that's been one of our beers that we've made since the beginning. It was one of our first 5 beers when we opened. It's actually down in the bright tank right now. That'll be the next one that we get ready, but again, not available today. I know, right? It should be on Friday. Yep. Cool. Well, that's what I have for you today. If you have any questions on the Fibonacci sequence or brewing, let me hear.
Okay. Yay! Do you have any questions? Are you ever going to make that beer again?
I don't see why not. So we recently, if you're not familiar, we recently got a new head brewer here at Fibonacci. So our previous brewer decided late last fall that, he just wasn't loving brewing anymore. And, it happens. I get it. It's not a fun job, especially here. It's a very lonely job. You're the only one down in the brew house all day. So we just brought in a new brewer. Yep. Yeah, we brew downstairs here. So we just brought in a new brewer back in January, and we're getting him acclimated now. So we're kind of going over what we've done in the past, kind of going through recipes, figuring out, ones that will revive or, ones that this might not be worth brewing again. We have not rolled this out, but as I mentioned, this was a collaboration beer with Alexandria and Darkness. So I think if we were to do it again, we'd probably get them involved so that they could brew it at the same time. Yeah, we actually all brewed it independently at our own breweries. Yep. We had staggered releases so that we could all attend each other's releases. I know we weren't at the time. I don't know if either of them either, and we still don't. We can't actually bring in, even if we do a collaboration with someone, we can't bring in finished beer into our brewery and sell it. So when we do collaborations, we have to brew it on site here to be able to sell it. The only way you can get around that, as I mentioned earlier, that brewers just make warts. If you bring it in before it's fermented, then we can. So if we went to somewhere and brewed it all at one place, and then we brought some of that unfermented wort back here, we could then ferment it here and sell it. But yeah, we didn't do that one for this one. We each did our own. So yeah, they were a little bit different. Whenever you're dealing with all different size systems and everything, trying to get a recipe brewed exactly the same from one facility to the next is near impossible. So yeah, it was fun to see the subtle differences between. I don't know. Have you seen? I don't know. I would have think they would have reached out to us if they were going to brew it again and put it on. I mean, not that we would care, but just to, it's fun, Right. Yep.
Yeah, it's kind of an abstract question.
Yeah.
So I recently saw PBS on biking sorts when this guy was trying to recreate these. They don't know how it's going to work. They're walking through this very complicated method to get the metal to where it's pure enough to work it. And you're describing, and I've heard it before, the brewing process. And my mind is doing the same. How did somebody figure out to do these steps in that order? Get the final product.
Yeah. I think it was probably accidental. So there's actually a step before the mash process, and that's called malting the grain. So you don't just use raw grains. It's malted first. So you're basically getting it to barely start sprouting, and then that's when you use it. So during that malting process, it will already start to convert some of those starches into sugars. The mashing process just kind of finishes that out. So what I'm guessing that the theories I've heard and what kind of makes sense, because no one would just know, right? To let's start to and now let's grind it up and then we'll make this liquid. The theory is that someone had grain and it got wet and it started malting on its own. And then they're like, well, we don't want to just throw this out, so let's make a tea with it. And then over time, and as they made the tea, then it started bubbling, and they're like, what's this? They thought it was magic. They didn't understand the complexities of yeast, the molecular level of how the yeast interacts with the sugars. And then, it would be bubbling. And then all they knew was they had to use a little bit of that previous batch, of whatever natural yeast and bacteria was in the air around at that time to get the next one started. I think it's a highly debated topic on whether that's actually how it went down, but I think that's the most accepted answer in that regard. Yep.
Is there an advantage to sticking to the sequence in the brewing process at all at the Fibonacci? Or was that just hey, let's see what we can do to make it fit?
Yes, this was let's see what we can do to make it fit. But yes, the hop that I was talking about, the hop isomerization, that does. So most of the brewing process, like if you're going to scale from like a 5-gallon batch to a 10-gallon batch, it's all linear. But with hops, the way that they're utilized during the boil, it's not linear. So that is actually a logarithmic function. And so that does. So boiling from, let's say 30 minutes to 60 minutes, you're not going to get double the hop utilization. You're going to get like 4 or 5 times the hop utilization. So that one is very specific, and that's why we chose 89 minutes. It's actually 90 minutes as a standard. You usually do like 30, 60, or 90-minute boils, but we chose 89. But yes, we did an hour and a half to get more bitterness out of that. Yep.
And then any other applications of Fibonacci to build the building, make the stairs, make the bathroom?
Was there? I'm sure we have some. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, one of the things we also specialize in here is using non-traditional brewing ingredients. So you got your water, your grains, your hops, and your yeast. But we also infuse a lot of other fresh local ingredients into our beers. And, those are all typically natural ingredients. We don't use like flavorings and stuff like that. So utilizing those other plants, we do a lot of herbs. We got a Thai basil beer with honey. That's really good. That'll actually, I don't know if that's going to be ready for this weekend, but soon, probably here in a couple weeks. Yep. Yeah, Rafa's down there in the fermenter right now. I think it's like 2 weeks out. But yeah, so the ingredients that we use do have a lot of tie-ins with Fibonacci Sequence, but the brewing process itself doesn't, lend itself to a lot of tie-ins.
Any other questions?
All beer has hops.
Yes.
All beer has hops.
All beer has hops. If it's
All beer is wheat. Not all beer.
correct. If it doesn't have hops, then it's not a beer. So typically a malt beverage without hops is known as a gruit, Gruit, I believe. And that is just what separates it. So you'll hear people call it a beer, but technically it has to have hops. It has to have those 4 ingredients to be a beer.
What if it has hops, but it doesn't have a grain?
So if you use a sugar source other than malted barley, wheat, whatever the grain is, then it's according to whatever that sugar source is. So if it's grapes, then it's known as wine. If it's honey, then it's known as mead. So the beer does have to use those 4 ingredients. So yeah, there's many other alcoholic beverages you can create with a sugar source and going through the fermentation process, but traditionally it's got to have grain and hops to be a beer. Yep. We do. We do not do traditional meads. We do what we call session meads, and these are more in line with like seltzers. So we're not a big fan of seltzers because it's just sugar and water. It's no fun in that. So we do meads, and then we infuse them with different botanicals. And we do them at lower ABVs than traditional meads. So most traditional meads are like 10, 13%, more like a wine. We do ours more like 5%, so it's a little more sessionable. Yes, Jeremy?
Stole my question.
Oh, yes.
What's the difference between, what makes it a milk stout?
Yeah, so the milk stout, the prunus that we have on, actually has what's known as milk sugar. That's what they call it. It's lactose added to it. So it typically adds a little bit of creaminess, a little more mouthfeel to it than a traditional stout.
What kind of beverage would typically be about 9% alcohol?
9%? Well, we do quite a few here. We got one at 8.9 on right now, which is a Belgian triple. Belgian triples are usually about 8 to 10%. So that's one. The Doppelbock's a little above that. That's 10%. We actually aged that in a rye whiskey barrel. Really, really good sipper. Be careful with that one. It goes down really quickly. What else do we have? Oh, the triple IPA, 10.2%. And the Imperial Goza, traditional Gozas are lower ABV, like 4 or 5%. This is an Imperial version, so basically using that sea salt and coriander that you use in a traditional Goza, we just basically doubled the alcohol content and then infused, I can't remember the name. They're tart cherry from Michigan. They have a real, I can't think of it. It's a certain variety of cherries that are really tart that Michigan's known for. Montmorency. Yes, thank you, Betty.
Anybody else? Question?
So considering you burned down Fed, have you considered celery to beer and
And do what?
celery and having cocktail for that?
Well, we age beers, in barrels. So you're saying something that's not carbonated, a traditional, more British style cask ale? Yeah, we've never done one. We don't have a Pullman system to make that easy. So we could, it's possible to tap it and just have it gravity fed to be able to pump it. But yeah, we've never done a cask ale, but I'm not against it. Do you brew? Yeah? Yeah, we got an English mild that would probably be pretty good in it. Yeah, cask ales, if you don't know, they're traditionally, they'll have some light carbonation just from the natural carbonation as it's fermenting, so as you cellar it. But yeah, it's not forced carbonated like traditional American beers. It's much less natural carbonation, and it's a very popular style, especially in the UK and other European nations do cask ales. So our system, we have 5 fermenters downstairs, so we can have 5 beers in the process during that fermentation process. That's the longest process. It's usually a good 7 to 10 days it'll be in there, and that's for primary fermentation. So for the yeast to consume all the sugars that are in that wort. And then you have what's called conditioning. So typically, especially with a lager, you want to let it sit for a little bit to clean up the process a little. So there's different off flavors that are created throughout the fermentation process that will naturally clean themselves up over time. So lagers typically sit a little longer. It can be about a 4 or 5 week process for us from when we brew it until we're moving it to package it up to be sold. Yep. So yeah, five beers is what we can have going at a time.
So what was the term for before it's fermented?
Wort.
You actually keep quantities of wort in storage for fermentation later? Or is it worth doing that?
No, but you can. We do not. But what we do, when we're barrel aging, it won't all fit in the barrel. We can't make exactly enough to fit in the barrel. So we'll typically have, a full barrel aging, and then whatever's left over, we just put in a keg. And then once it's done aging in the barrel, we then blend those back together. But it's already been fermented at that point. We don't keep just the wort unfermented around. Yep. Yeah, I have. Yes. Yeah. So Carolyn Brewing up near Dayton, if you're not familiar, they use old school techniques for making beer, which includes also letting it naturally ferment, which means whatever yeast and bacteria is available, in the surrounding area is what's going to ferment that. Most commercial breweries do not do that because you lose control over that finished product. That natural yeast and bacteria you can't control. So different yeasts give different off flavors, if you will, but have a different effect on the beer itself. We actually do one beer here that we do not pasteurize the fruit. So we go out and we forage for pawpaws. I don't know if you guys are familiar with pawpaws. Yeah, so every fall we go out and forage for pawpaws, and they're such a pain to process because they have like 1 million seeds in them, right? Well, a lot. 8 to 13 in each one. But they're very hard to process. It's very labor intensive. So we were talking to our good friends down at Urban Artifact, and they do a lot of like wild fermentation and stuff. And they're like, just don't pasteurize them. They're like, the bacteria and yeast that's going to be on that fruit is going to impart some goodness to it. So we took that to heart. First year we made it, I'm like, this is 10 times better than it normally is. Let's do this. So that beer changes immensely. Like, if you let that beer sit for a year, that natural yeast and bacteria will take that beer from, I think, pretty good fresh, but kind of a little bit sweeter into like this really dry, almost champagne-like, really tight bubbles, super dry, almost like a brute, and it just changes immensely over a period of 1 year. So, but yeah, I like Carolina. I like what they're doing. I haven't been up there for a couple years. I heard they've changed their practices a little where they are doing some more controlled fermentation now, but I haven't been back since they started doing that. Yeah. Only good things to say about breweries.
That led me to another question. I always heard that, the born-on date is really important. I don't know where I got that from.
A commercial.
Oh, yeah, maybe it was a commercial. And you just said you could show it for up to a year and still get some good taste.
Yes.
How does that work?
So there's a huge spectrum of beers, right? Some beers are really good fresh, like your light lagers. You want that as fresh as can be. Those aren't going to improve over time. Anything that is higher in ABV, barrel aged, using some wild fermentation techniques like we just talked about with the pawpaw, those beers can evolve over time and just turn into something spectacular that you can't make a fresh beer taste like. It becomes so complex. It's like wine, right? So, a lot of wines, they'll talk about the vintage and, what year it was and, how the rain was that season. It just makes that wine just turn into something spectacular over time that you can't recreate. So there's many beer styles that also lend themselves very well to that. Yep. Yeah. Typically barrel-aged stouts. I would stay away from light lagers and hoppier beers. Those typically don't age very well. The hops kind of go down pretty quickly. But yeah, stouts, barrel-aged stouts especially, a lot of sours, they actually improve with age. Yep. There are two beers I would say, Hop Slam and 120 are very, very good aged IPAs. But they drink more like a barley wine, like a hoppy barley wine as you age them, and not as like a bitter IPA that most, if you want an IPA, you typically want, something a little more bitter. But yeah, I agree. I love the 120.
Any other questions? Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Tom.
Yeah, absolutely.
Alrighty, folks. If it is your first time here, or I just haven't met you yet, please come over and say hello. My name is DJ. I run Next month, April 19th, Ryan Ridgely is coming back. He was here in October. He talked to us about nocturnal animals. I thought that'd be fun for Halloween. So he's going to be back. He's going to talk to us about spring babies, what to do if you find them. It might not be what you think. But anyway, again, April 19th, come right here, same time, same bat channel, all that. All right, thank you so much for coming, everybody.